There are handouts on that little table back there by the baptismal font, if you'd like to get one. This morning, we're going to take a look at some scenes from the life of Abraham. So remember, we began looking at Abraham last Sunday. We looked at chapters 12 and 13, and we saw God calling Abraham to leave his home, his family, and to journey to the land of Canaan, trusting God. And I said that what God's doing here is he's shaping a people who live against the grain of the world. And basically what we're going to do is, as we move through the Old Testament, we'll begin to learn more and more about what living against the grain of the world involves. So more about that as time goes on. But I want to begin with an episode that occurs toward the end of Genesis 14. So in Genesis 14, 1 through 16, Abraham's nephew Lot is taken captive in a war amongst some Canaanite kings, and Abraham goes to rescue him. And this sort of gives us a picture of Abraham as a person who takes his responsibilities seriously. So he actually risks his life, and he goes and rescues Lot, and now he's coming back from this victory. And this is what happens. It's an important scene. It's Genesis 14, 17 through 20, or thereabouts. It's very brief, but it's also very important. So here it is. After his return from the defeat of Kedaloam, and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed him, that is Abraham, and said, "Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." So really, it's a brief scene, but there's a number of layers to this. I want to explore a couple of them. So thing number one, Abraham's heading back from this victory. He meets this mysterious figure, Melchizedek. I'll say more about him in just a minute. And Melchizedek kind of brings this interesting offering of bread and wine. And then Melchizedek does something really interesting. Melchizedek is a Canaanite, that he's not part of Abraham's family. And yet, he blesses Abraham and says two really important things to him. Blessed be Abraham by God Most High. Abraham is blessed by God Most High, so it's being made clear here that this victory that Abraham's won is a blessing from God. And then he says this, "Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High." That is, here we have a picture, and we have a couple of, this occurs throughout the Old Testament. We have a Canaanite, a non-Israelite, who recognizes the people of God as being blessed, and who recognizes the God of Israel as being the one true God. We'll see things like this all the way throughout the Old Testament. The next time we'll see it, and I'll point this out when we get there, will be in the book of Joshua. And this time, the person who recognizes the blessed people of Israel and the God of Israel as the one true God will be Rahab, the Canaanite, she's called a prostitute. Today we refer to her as she was in the entertainment business. But she recognizes the God of Israel as the one true God, and then she turns up later again at the end of Hebrews 11 in that list of heroes and heroines of the faith. So there she is among this list of all these illustrious people, because she recognized the God of Israel as the one true God. So that's one thing. The other thing is something here about Melchizedek. He's a really interesting figure, and he's also really important. So I want to say a few things about him. His name means king of righteousness. Melchizedek means king of righteousness. And we're told here a couple interesting things about him. We're told, this is really unusual, Melchizedek is both a king and a priest. That never occurred in the ancient world. Those were always separate things. So he's unusual in that sense. And we're also told what he's king of. He's the king of Salem, which at this point is a Canaanite city. Later on, under the reign of David, the name is going to be changed and it will become Jerusalem. Melchizedek is the king of Jerusalem. He's a king and a priest, and his name means king of righteousness. Now, Melchizedek isn't mentioned again in the whole of the Old Testament until Psalm 110. And this is Psalm 110, verse 4, is addressed to the king of Israel, and this is what's said. You, the king of Israel, are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. That is, in Psalm 110 became a messianic psalm. Melchizedek became a figure by which the Messiah was to be understood, and sure enough, Melchizedek pops up again in the letter to the Hebrews, such that Hebrews uses Melchizedek as a way of thinking about Christ. He too is the king of righteousness. He too is both a priest and a king. And his priesthood actually now precedes the priesthood of Aaron, which we'll see instituted later on in the book of Exodus. That is, the letter of the Hebrews understands Melchizedek as a prefiguration of the person of Christ. Now, the early church, and this is just kind of like a footnote to make things even more interesting, the early church saw it as significant that Melchizedek, who here represents Christ, right, shows up bringing an unusual offering, an offering of bread and wine. That is, the early church saw this as a prefiguration of the Eucharist. We'll see that there are other of these things. The early church did not see the Eucharist as simply like materializing in the New Testament. It saw it as being promised and prefigured back in the Old. So a really important scene. Now the next episode I want to take a quick look at is in Genesis 15. This is really important. Here, God makes a covenant with Abram, whose name will be changed to Abraham. I'll read part of it to you so you can kind of get the context. This is Genesis 15:1 and following. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. So God's now talking to Abram. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward will be very great. But Abram said, O Lord, what will you give me, for I continue childless? Remember back in Genesis 12, God promised Abraham not only land, but many descendants, and he's gotten neither of those things. Okay, the land that he's been promised is filled with Canaanites, and Sarah is infertile, and Abraham is old, and so no children. So Abraham's getting a little nervous about this, and so he asks God about it. O Lord, what will you give me, for I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. So now this is God's response. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. So that's the first part. So notice what happens here. Abram's getting a little nervous about no children, no descendants, and actually no possibility of descendants. And so he's kind of like complaining to God about this. And God actually takes this complaint seriously. And so God says, okay, look, you will have a son, I promise. And takes him outside, so it's at night, takes him outside of the tent and says, look up in the sky there. And of course, there are no big cities around, so Abram can see all the stars. And God says to him, well, you know what? If you could count all those stars, you would know how many descendants you're going to have. And we're told here that Abram accepts this. That is, he trusts God, believes this is going to come true, and we're told here that God reckons or counts this to him as righteousness. So a brief word of explanation here before we go on, because this is an important scene. Once again, we're coming back to the Old Testament's notion of faith, okay? Faith here involves really two things that go together. On one hand, faith is a trust in the faithfulness of God. Faith also is obedience. It's living out that trust. Okay, you trust God, and then you live out the trust. Faith and obedience, trust and obedience, those things go together. The other really important word here that's going to be hugely important as time goes on is this word righteousness. Now, righteousness here means something different than its connotation in modern English. We tend to associate righteousness in modern English with some form of moral perfection. That's not its primary meaning here. Here, to be righteous is to be properly related to somebody. Okay? To be righteous here is to be properly related to God, and that proper relationship is trust and obedience. In this scene here, Abram now appears as someone who is righteous. He's properly related to God because he trusts in God and obeys him. So really important idea here, the idea of righteousness. Now, here comes the covenant. So the story doesn't stop here. The story continues on in Genesis 15:7. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And he said to him, bring a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, and a ram 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought all these and cut them in half and laid them half over against the other, but he did not cut the birds in half. And then this happens. This is Genesis 15:17. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces of the sacrificed animals. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I will give this land, from the river of Egypt, the great river, to the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, the Jebusites, and the Tallahasseites. So notice what happens here. Two really important things. God seals this promise with something visible, a sacrifice. The sacrifice here becomes a visible and tangible sign of the promise that God has made to Abram. That is, what God's doing here is God is sort of condescending to Abraham's need. Abraham needs something visible to hold on to. And by the way, this is the foundation for the Christian theology of sacraments. Sacraments are visible and tangible signs of God's promise, right? There's something we can hold on to. Pay very close attention if you're going to be at 11:15 to the post-communion prayer, where you'll see this idea present. But here's what's going on. This is a sort of an ancient Near Eastern covenant ceremony, and we're going to reenact this at some point. So here's what happens. Let's say that Rohan and I are going to engage in a covenant with one another. What we do is we get together and we sacrifice some animals. We kill them, we cut them in half, and we lay the pieces out. And there's like a little pathway between them, and then Rohan and I walk between the sacrifice animals. And the idea here is this. If either one of us fails to live up to our promise, may we end up like these animals, dead and cut in half. So we'll reenact this one Sunday, just so you can kind of get an idea about what it looks like. I think it'd be kind of fun. You can see here, right, that there's there's a great deal of seriousness about this. So what would normally happen, right, is that whoever was entering into the covenant would walk between these animals. But did you notice something here as I read the story? Something really important happens. Abraham does not walk between the sacrificed pieces. Mysteriously, this kind of torch and a smoking fire pot, which seemed to represent God, passed between the pieces. So something really important is happening here, and it's this. Abraham does not walk through the sacrificed animals because God's making it clear that he's assuming responsibility not only for his part of the covenant, but also for Abraham's. In the end, God is going to be the one who will guarantee that both sides of this covenant are kept. And we'll see, the New Testament will eventually reveal how that happens. Okay, and we'll get to that in about 2 years. So, hope you can hang on that long. Okay, so but this is a really important scene. So covenant, visible signs. God's the one who is the upholder of the covenant. Now, I want to take a quick look at 1 through 16, because this is another sort of important incident in the life of Abraham. So, still no son yet, no land. Canaanites are still there. Sarah's not pregnant, and so Sarah comes up with a brilliant idea. Here it is. And by the way, you know this is wrong because, right, Sarah proposes an idea that will help God along. Okay, you know, right, that whenever we try to help God along, what the likely outcome of that's going to be, right? Disaster. And sure enough, that's what happens. So here it is. This is Genesis 16, 1 through 16. I'll read just part of it. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abraham, "Behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, that it may be that it shall obtain children by her." And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. You may remember this, that phrase may sound familiar. We heard God say this back in Genesis 3:17 to Adam. You have listened to the voice of your wife. That is, what Sarah is proposing here is sort of like an Eve-like thing. You know, it would be a really good idea to eat that fruit on the tree in the middle of the garden. I watched a whole show about this on HGTV, about how this fruit can be cooked in like 7 different ways, right? Let's try it. So after Abraham had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress, that is, Sarah. So notice what happens here. This would have been perfectly okay in this culture. You're not having any children, so Sarah has, here's Hagar, my maidservant. Why don't we have a son by her? Here she is. Take her as a wife, or probably more or less like a concubine, that sort of thing. And so that's what happens, and the result of all this is, sure enough, a male child whose name is named Ishmael. It is, notice here, Abraham and Sarah have deliberately actually failed to trust God at this point. They've decided to take matters in their own hands. Now the question is, well, what's going to happen? Oh, here it is. Sure enough, as I said, Hagar bears a child by the name of Ishmael. Hagar is forced to flee. There's a marital conflict that gets set up here. And by the way, this is interesting. The Old Testament actually never kind of condemns polygamy, but whenever we see polygamy portrayed, it always is creating problems. So there's a hugely negative attitude toward polygamy in the Old Testament, and eventually, of course, certainly by the time of Jesus, polygamy has completely died out, and the principle of monogamy sort of reigns supreme. So Hagar and her son are forced to flee out in the wilderness. They've arrived at a point where it looks like both of them are going to die, and at this point, God intervenes. And this is what happens in Genesis 16:10. The angel of the Lord said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so they cannot be numbered for multitude. That is, notice here, God's promise to bless Abraham and his offspring. And even though Ishmael is the result of a bad decision on Abraham and Sarah's part, God still keeps his promise by blessing Ishmael. That is, this scene is an important indication, I think, of the Old Testament's understanding of grace. Blessing clearly here, right, is not a reward for good behavior, because Abraham and Sarah have not behaved well. Blessing here, rather, is the result of God's gracious intent. And so Ishmael gets blessed, in effect, in spite of himself. Later on, we're going to meet another character who gets blessed in spite of himself, and that's the patriarch Jacob. And we'll take a look at his story. So here we have this idea, right, that God decides to bless Abraham, and God's not going to go back on that promise, even though Abraham has done something that he really shouldn't do. Now, I want to take a quick look here at another scene. And this is Genesis 17:1 and following. I think also a really important scene. This is Genesis 17:15. So God now appears in the scene again, and he promises now a son to Abraham and Sarah. So here's what happens. And God said to Abraham, Abraham's name has been changed now. And so it was Abram, it's now Abraham, which means something like great father, father of many nations, big daddy, something like that. That is, his identity's been changed. So in the Old Testament, right, when your name gets changed, your mission, your vocation, your status is changed as well. So here's what happens. God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall call her name Sarah. That shall be her name. And Sarah here means something like princess. My wife's name is Sarah. And I've been threatening for years. You may have seen this t-shirt that says, all I ask is that you treat me no differently than the queen. I've been threatening for years to get that shirt for her. But Sarah here simply means something like princess. I will bless her. Moreover, I will give you a son by her, and I will bless her, and she shall have children, and nations shall come from her. Kings and people shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? That is, notice what happens here. In response to this word from God that he's going to have a son, Abraham's response is basically he just finds this so hilarious. He just literally falls over laughing. He in effect says, okay, God, tell me another good one. You're a great stand-up comic, God. But there's something really important here that we don't want to miss. And this is connected to a story which follows it in 18. Let me read that, and then I want to connect the two stories because there's some similarity. This is 18, 1 through 10. And the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, Abraham, and he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the door of the tent to meet them, and he bowed down to them to the earth and said, O Lord, I have found favor in your sight. do not pass by your servant. Interesting point here, right? We're told there are three men who are coming. Notice how Abram addresses all three of them. He addresses them in the singular, Lord. I'll say something about that in just a minute. And he said, "O Lord, if I found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought to wash your feet, to rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after you may pass on." So Abraham runs and is very hospitable. He has this wonderful meal prepared for these three men who are addressed as one. And this is what happens in 18:9. They said to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "She is in the tent." The Lord said, once again, they, the Lord, singular, plural, singular, plural, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years, and the way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I indeed have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord?'" So notice here, both Abraham and Sarah respond in the same way to this promise of a son. They believe it's outrageous, sort of like impossible. They both laugh, and so, fittingly, they're told to name their son Isaac, which in Hebrew means he laughs. Every time Abraham and Sarah talk or mention the name of their son, they're going to be reminded of what they've done. But here's the really interesting part. It's this question that's posed to Abraham and Sarah: is anything too hard for the Lord? That is, God comes back with this question to them. I'm the Lord, I'm the Creator. Is anything too hard for me? We're going to see this expression again. I'll mention it now, and then when we come to it in 3 years, we'll take a look at it. This is Luke 1:37, where another son is promised to another woman. In this case, it's Mary, and the son promised is Jesus. And the idea is that when this child's born of this virgin mother, you shall know that nothing is impossible for God. In both cases here, we have, in effect, a kind of proclamation of the gospel. That is, Genesis 18:14 is a proclamation of the gospel. Nothing is impossible for God. Nothing is impossible for God. And that's because, right, as we've seen, this is why we went through Genesis 1 and 2, God's the Creator. There's nothing that's impossible for him, right, because he's the one who brought the whole universe into existence out of nothing. Therefore, there's no limitations that he works under. So here we have a kind of proclamation of the gospel here in the midst of the Old Testament. Now, one final thing. This is real quick. This is Genesis 18:22 and following. Right after this incident with the promise of the birth of Isaac, God's on a kind of an investigative mission. He's heard things about the city of Sodom, which is awfully unjust and corrupt. It seems to sort of represent what's going on with the world. And here's what happens. Oh, by the way, I mentioned there's this interesting back and forth between the three men, singular and plural, singular and plural. The early church, of course, read this as a prefiguration of the doctrine of the Trinity. The three men addressed as Lord. And this is actually the inspiration, if you've ever seen it or would like to see it. It's Nikolai Rubilev's icon of the Holy Trinity. This is actually where it comes from. You see three figures sitting at a table. The Father is in the middle, the Son is to the left, the Spirit's to the right. And they've all got their heads nodded toward one another. which shows, on one hand, right, the distinctness of the persons, but their fundamental unity. So it's kind of an interesting and also beautiful icon. So here's what happens in Genesis 18:22 and following. So then turned from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Once again, the three men and the Lord, the three men and the Lord, back and forth. Then Abraham drew near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you sweep away?" So God's decided that if Sodom actually is as unjust and awful as he's heard, he's going to destroy the city. And Abraham kind of stops him and asks him, "Well, what if there are like 50 righteous people still left in the city? Would you destroy it? Well, what if there are like 40 righteous people? Well, what if there are 30? Now, this seems kind of like an odd and sort of an odd story, but it makes an important point that we don't want to pass over. 2 points here that are significant. Point number one. Notice here that Abraham's questioning of God is not founded on some kind of skepticism or mere curiosity. Abraham here believes that God is fundamentally just and is asking God if he's going to actually act out of his justice. So this is a question that's actually motivated by faith. Really important. Second thing is this, and this actually may be more important. This little scene, I think, illustrates something that's really important, and that is this, that God now has just entered into a covenant with Abram. And this questioning that goes back and forth between God and Abraham actually is a sign of the relationship that exists between them. That is, the relationship that God makes with Abraham, the relationship that God will be making with Israel, and of course the relationship that God creates between us, right, is a relationship in which God begins to take his people into his confidence. They're not just sort of like, Abraham isn't just simply sort of like an automaton who sort of carries out orders. There's an intimacy that God begins to create between himself and Abram, and it's an intimacy that actually allows a space for this kind of question. You're the judge of all the earth. I expect that you're going to, whatever's going on in Sodom, I expect that you're going to act justly, aren't you? But in effect, God is not like offended by this question. And it's a sign of this relationship between Abraham and himself, which is a relationship of intimacy. And there we have to stop. What we're going to do is I want to pick things up briefly. We'll take a look at what happens, how this story turns out in Genesis 19, what happens in Sodom, and then we're going to jump to Genesis 21, which is probably one of the most important stories in the Old Testament. The Akedah, the binding of Isaac in Genesis 21.